Alexander the Great was known for his daring and innovative tactics as he led his armies to conquer vast territories. One of his most audacious moves was crossing the Hydaspes River in India during the monsoon season. But why did he do it? And what tactical risks did he take? Let us delve into this historical event and explore the reasons behind Alexander's decision and the strategies he employed to overcome the challenges of crossing the river in such adverse conditions. First, we need to talk about why Alexander even considered doing something so risky. He had multiple options available to him that would have been far less dangerous. The year is 326 BC and Alexander has just defeated King Porus in a hard-fought battle near the Hydaspes River. Now, he needs to get his army across this river, which is in full flood due to the monsoon season. On one side of the river, his army is exhausted and weakened by the recent battle. They've lost lots of men and their baggage train, which contains much-needed supplies and resources, is on the other side. To make matters worse, the Macedonians are now in full retreat. They're sending back their wounded and packing up their camp to move out. This means that Alexander doesn't have access to these valuable resources and his troops aren't exactly in peak fighting condition. Meanwhile, the other side of the river, there are two passes through the hills that lead to more open country. These passes are roughly 7 miles apart, with one being around 8 miles from the battlefield and the other being roughly 14 miles away. These passes were essentially shortcuts that allowed you to bypass the rest of the Hydaspes, which was in full flood. They were also close enough to each other that if you managed to get your troops through them, you could quickly form them back into a coherent fighting force. So at this point, you might be thinking, why didn't Alexander just send his men through one of these passes? Well, that's not as easy as it sounds. For one thing, the monsoon rains had turned the river into a raging torrent, making it nearly impossible to cross. Even if you could find a way across the river, the other side wasn't exactly a walk in the park either. As soon as Alexander and his army crossed the river, they would be in enemy territory. King Porus's forces would be waiting for them with the element of surprise on their side. To make things even more challenging, Alexander's army wasn't exactly at full strength. They had suffered heavy casualties in the battle with King Porus, and they were tired, hungry, and wet from the relentless rain. Not exactly the ideal conditions for a surprise attack. Despite these challenges, Alexander decided to go for it. He chose to cross the river rather than risking an attack from Porus's army. But why? Well, let's start with the fact that a direct attack would have been extremely risky. Porus's army knew the terrain, and they would have been well prepared to defend their position. Trying to force a crossing would have been costly and time-consuming. And Alexander didn't have the luxury of time on his side. He needed to move his army as quickly as possible to consolidate his gains in India. But there was another reason why Alexander decided to risk crossing the river. He was confident that his army was superior to Porus's forces. He knew that if he could just get his men across the river, he would be able to defeat Porus's army and secure his position in India. So he gambled, putting everything on the line with a daring river crossing. It was a risky move, but it was one that Alexander felt he had to take if he wanted to succeed in his campaign. Now let's talk about the tactical risks that Alexander took while crossing the river. First, he had to find a way to cross the river. The water was cold and fast-flowing, making it difficult to navigate. But Alexander's engineers found a solution. They constructed pontoons using boats and other materials that were available to them. These pontoons allowed their army to cross the river safely, but they were not without their challenges. The current was so strong that several of the pontoons were swept away, causing chaos and confusion among the troops. Alexander's men had to work quickly and efficiently to repair the damage and keep the crossing operation on track. Another challenge was the lack of supplies. The baggage train that contained food, water, and other essential supplies was still on the other side of the river. Without it, Alexander's troops were forced to survive off of what little they could carry with them, making the arduous journey even more difficult. They were also vulnerable to attacks from King Porus's army. You could easily have ambushed them while they were in this weakened state. But Alexander's cavalry protected his troops, fending off any attacks and ensuring their safety. And then there was the weather. The monsoons were in full swing, which meant that the river was in flood and the troops were constantly wet and exposed to the elements. This made it difficult to maintain morale, but Alexander's officers worked hard to keep the troops' spirits high. They reminded the men of their past victories and urged them to press on despite the difficulties they faced. The crossing was a test of endurance, both for the troops and for Alexander's leadership. But in the end, it was a success. His army made it safely to the other side of the river and he was able to defeat King Porus's forces, securing his position in India. But it wasn't just the military victory that made the crossing significant. It was also a testament to Alexander's courage and determination. He took a huge risk by crossing the river, but it paid off in the end. So what can we learn from Alexander's decision to cross the river during the monsoon season? Well, for one thing, we can see that even the greatest leaders take risks. Alexander wasn't invincible and he wasn't afraid to gamble when the situation called for it. Secondly, we can see that preparation and logistics are crucial for success. Alexander's engineers and officers did a great job of planning and executing the crossing operation, which likely saved many lives and ensured the army's ultimate victory. Finally, we can see the importance of having a clear goal in mind. Alexander knew that he needed to get his army across the river as quickly as possible to consolidate his gains in India. He didn't let the challenges of the crossing get in the way of that goal. Instead, he forged ahead, determined to succeed. Crossing the river in the monsoon season was a bold and risky move. Alexander's army was outnumbered, outgunned and exhausted. But with careful planning and execution, they made it across the river safely and emerged victorious on the other side. It was a testament to Alexander's courage, determination, and military prowess. And it remains one of the most famous river crossings in history. Now, here's a question for you. What do you think would have happened if Alexander's army had been defeated in the battle with King Porus? Would his empire have crumbled without this key victory? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Alexander the Great is a legendary figure whose story continues to fascinate people today. If you want to learn more about his life and conquests, we highly recommend checking out our channel where we have plenty of videos covering various aspects of his fascinating story. From his childhood and rise to power to his military campaigns and legacy, we've got you covered. So go ahead and check out our other videos on Alexander the Great and expand your knowledge. You'll be amazed by what you learn. That's all for today, folks. Thanks for joining me on this journey through history. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to show your support. We'd love to have you back for more exciting adventures. Until next time, stay curious and keep learning. The Battle of the Hydaspes River was one of the most spectacular battles in ancient history. It is remembered for Alexander's near defeat and his tactical genius in the face of adversity. But what many people forget about this battle is the role that elephants played. War elephants are always an exciting thing to see in battle because they are so inspiring. They can crush chariots, gore infantry and trample cavalry. The sight of a charging elephant has struck fear into the hearts of even the bravest soldiers throughout history. And while we think of elephants being used by armies in Asia and Africa, there were actually war elephants in Europe as well. And it was these European elephants that almost destroyed Alexander the Great at the Battle of the Hydaspes. Today, we are going to be looking at how Porus deployed his war elephants at the Battle of the Hydaspes and how they nearly destroyed Alexander's army. So get yourself a hot drink, sit back and relax. It's story time. In 326 BC, Alexander the Great and his army were in Punjab, fighting against King Porus. Porus was a small but fierce king who commanded an army of around 200,000 men. On the other side, Alexander only had around 40,000 soldiers. Although outnumbered, Alexander still decided to attack. He split his force into 3 parts and attacked from the center. He hoped that he could break through Porus's lines and then reunite with his other 2 forces. But what Alexander didn't know was that Porus had prepared for his attack. When the first line of Macedonian infantry met the Indian infantry, they quickly discovered that these Indians were unlike any other enemy they had fought before. These Indian soldiers fought with incredible ferocity and determination. Many scholars have pointed out that this may have been because they were fighting a defensive battle and also that they were fighting for their homeland. And like Alexander's soldiers, who were mostly mercenaries and some of whom weren't even Greek, the men under Porus's command were united by their homeland. This made them fight with more vigor and determination. As the battle raged, word reached Alexander that his other two forces were having trouble breaking through the Indian lines. Realizing that his army would be wiped out unless he provided assistance, Alexander ordered his cavalry to break through the Indians and help his friends. When they reached the rest of their army, he ordered them to march along the battlefield to the west until they reached a point where they could support the infantry that was being pushed back in the center. This helped turn the tide of battle back in the Macedonians' favor. But this wasn't the end of the battle. As Alexander's forces pushed forward, they encountered another obstacle. In front of them were large numbers of Indian war elephants. There were said to be between 20 and 30 elephants in total, which makes them the largest number of elephants ever seen in a single battle. According to Plutarch, when Alexander saw these elephants, he thought he was doomed. Elephants had never been part of a Macedonian army, and so Alexander had no experience in fighting against them. So let's take a moment to look at how the Indian war elephants operated. Just like today's war elephants, these elephants were absolutely massive. These Asian war elephants could reach up to 9 feet tall and weigh over 6 tons. That's as tall as a giraffe and heavier than a double-decker bus. These elephants were trained to charge into enemy formations and wreak havoc. An elephant's tusks and immense bulk meant that it could easily gore infantry, while its sheer size meant that it could easily step on and crush infantry. They were also used to pull chariots into battle, so overall, elephants were a very flexible and useful tool on the battlefield. Elephants were chosen for their size, strength, and intelligence. Once captured, they were taken back to a training camp where they were forced to fight against each other to the death. Only the strongest and most intelligent survived and were kept for military purposes. These elephants were fed huge amounts of food, including corn, sugarcane, rice, bananas, and fruit. They also drank huge quantities of water and wine. They were given these things to keep them happy and also to fatten them up to make them stronger. It took around 50 men to care for just one war elephant. Because of this, elephants were very expensive to keep, and so they were usually only kept by wealthy kings or used in times of great need. Back at the battle, the elephants were causing all kinds of carnage in the Macedonian ranks. Men were getting gored, tusked, and crushed underfoot. Chariots were overturned and horses were trampled. For a moment, it seemed as if Alexander's army would be routed, but his officers quickly came up with a plan to defeat the elephants. As we mentioned earlier, war elephants were intelligent creatures, but unfortunately for Porus, his elephants were facing some of the most intelligent soldiers in the world. The Macedonian phalangites. The phalangites were armed with long spears, sharp swords, and sturdy shields. As the elephants charged into the Macedonian lines, the phalangites leaned forward and thrust their spears into the sides of the elephants. At first, the elephants seemed unfazed by the spears, but soon they started to tire. One by one, the elephants fell down, either pierced by too many spears or exhausted from the battle. It is important to remember that these elephants weren't invincible. They were living creatures with vital organs just like us. The Macedonian plan was successful, and eventually all of Porus's elephants were slain. With their biggest advantage gone, Porus's army was quickly defeated. The Battle of the Hydaspes was one of the closest calls in Alexander's life. If he had lost this battle, it would have been devastating for his empire. Not only would he have lost prestige, but he would also have lost control of the region. After winning the battle, Alexander decided to spare Porus's life, and after the war, he actually visited Porus in his capital city. One of the things that impressed him the most was the size of the elephant stables. They were bigger than anything he had ever seen before. Alexander realized that he had been lucky to defeat such a powerful king. If you enjoyed this episode, with a special thanks to my supporters, you can support the channel through donations. Thank you all so much for watching. If you want to watch another episode, then click here. Alright guys, I'm back again with another episode of Who Dares Wins. As always, it's good to be back. Today we are taking a look at an ancient battle that I don't think any of us here really knows much about. If anything at all, we're gonna be looking at the Battle of Hydaspes, also known as the Battle of the River Bees. This was a battle fought between the armies of Alexander the Great and Porus in 326 BC near the modern-day city of Lahore in Pakistan. And today, we are going to try and answer which sources give the most reliable casualty estimates for each side at this battle. As usual, the first thing that we need to do is to take a quick look at what the sources themselves have to say about how many men fell in battle. First, let's start with Plutarch's Life of Alexander. He writes that at the end of the battle, the Macedonians had lost 700 men. Next, we have Quintus Curtius Rufus's account of the Alexandrian epic. He gives a total of 700 casualties for the Macedonian side, exactly the same as Plutarch, but he doesn't give any figures for the Indian side. Unfortunately, that's because his work is incomplete. In the section that should come right after that, he should have given the Indian casualties, but the text is just lost to us. Moving on, we have the account by Justin, who was a Roman senator and historian. He wrote a history of the world in 34 books. Only a few fragments of this work survived, but this particular one actually does give us some interesting information about the Battle of the Hydaspes. According to Justin, Alexander lost 2,000 infantry and 10 cavalrymen, which is slightly different to Arrian's account. Interestingly, though, when we compare these figures, we can see that they're pretty similar to those given by Plutarch. This could mean that Plutarch was directly using Justin's work for his own account. After all, Justin did write around 200 years before Plutarch. However, as Justin only gives us the figures for the Macedonian losses, it's unlikely that he was the source for Plutarch's 8,000 Indian losses. It is far more likely that these two figures were actually taken from a now-lost account by a different author, such as Callinicus, who was a Greek historian specializing in the wars of Alexander the Great. He wrote a 12-book history of Alexander's campaigns. But unfortunately nothing from this work has survived. Finally, we have the version of events given to us by the Indian writer, the author of the book called the Mahabharata. Now, obviously, considering that this book was written in India, it's not surprising that the author is extremely pro-Indian and anti-Macedonian. The text claims that the Indian army under King Porus consisted of 100,000 foot soldiers and 20,000 horsemen. Of course, such figures are almost certainly an exaggeration. They could even be an exaggeration by a factor of 10. But we will talk more about that later in the video. For now, let's focus on the actual battle itself. According to the text, the Indian army utterly routed Alexander's forces, killing or wounding all of them. If we combine these figures, then we're talking about a total of 120,000 casualties on the Macedonian side. Obviously, this account is clearly unreliable because it claims that every single Macedonian soldier was either killed or wounded. It goes without saying that not even the worst Macedonian soldier could have inflicted so much damage on their opponents. Nor would they have survived the aftermath of the battle, but we'll return to this source and its figures a bit later. So to recap, we have the following figures. I think that the best way to figure out the truth is to go with the lowest possible estimate for the Indian army's casualties. And even this isn't particularly low. Arrian does state that Porus had a large army, but he doesn't claim that it was 8,000 strong. That claim comes from Plutarch, so with no evidence to support this figure, I don't think it's likely that this is correct. And instead I believe that a conservative estimate for the Indian losses would be around 1,000. Then, with that in mind, the only source that works for both sides is Arrian's. He gives the Macedonians 2,000 casualties and the Indians 700. So in my opinion, this set of figures is likely the most reliable. Now to finish off this video, I want to talk a little bit about why the Indians suffered so heavily at this battle. I mean, according to our most reliable sources, they completely dominated the battlefield. Yet they still lost thousands of men. Well, the answer is simple. They didn't just lose men on the battlefield, they lost men to malaria as well. You see, the rainy season had just begun in the Punjab region when Alexander's army showed up. Malaria was widespread in the area and his troops were absolutely decimated by the disease. 2. Make things worse, the majority of his troops had never even seen a battle before. This wasn't because Alexander's men were inexperienced soldiers. Instead, it was because he preferred to use diplomacy and subterfuge rather than brute force. However, when diplomacy failed, as it eventually did with Porus, he had to rely on his untested levies, and this lack of experience, combined with the effects of malaria, is probably what caused them to suffer so heavily. Luckily for Alexander, though, he managed to hold on long enough for his elite companion cavalry to get through their training. And they were able to turn the tide of the battle and achieve a decisive victory. Thank you for watching. Thank you very much. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video, and I hope that you've learned something new. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.